on the spot, Tom, but if you did, we could start there and then ask Amanda as soon as she jumps on.
Sure. Yeah. Just briefly, Jody, I know last meeting, we spent a lot of time talking about sort of landowner size, what small landowners are currently doing, what are the kind of the tools that are at their disposal right now, looking at sort of existing forest land and conversion of forest land. Just a quick reminder that we also want to be talking, and I think we'll get into that today and beyond, but what additional steps can landowners take, and how can they sequester more carbon on their property? So talking about maintaining what we have, but also looking forward, looking ahead to building on those, that the carbon stocks on those small landowners. So just wanted to put that out there. I know that's, I think that's relatively clear to everyone, but just a quick reminder.
Great, thank you. Well, why don't we get started, and then when Amanda jumps on, if she has any further remarks, we can circle back to her. Where we usually start with these meetings, this is our third meeting, is to, hold on. Oh, good. Dana's jumping up at 10:30 for a bit. For good, I think. All right, we have some folks who are leaving early, one individual at 11 for a short period of time, another individual at 11:55, and then a third at 10:30. So it's good to know that. I really appreciate you letting me know that in advance. I'm going to mention sort of a homework assignment, if you will, at the beginning of the meeting so that it's in your minds while you're listening to the presentations today and having your conversation today, but also to make sure those of you who have to leave the meeting earlier are aware of it. So where we generally start is just a reminder of ground rules.
Yeah, the area would be a part at that point, so I think that could work. Is Jason doing his work on just a single shift?
And somebody's muting, I think. I think that's you, Tom. If you're able to mute yourself, that'd be great. So we start our meetings and end them on time, and just it was a pretty hefty packet, I think you may have realized, and appreciate the fact that you're spending the time reading that in advance and coming to the meetings having digested all of that. So while we're here trying to stay as engaged as possible, leaving your phones aside, not checking your email, and striving for as equal airtime as possible so that everyone is able to participate fully. There will also be an opportunity, as there are at all meetings, for public comment. And we're essentially trying to, there's a lot of knowledge in this room, if you will, and we all have our own preconceptions about what's right and what's best. And so I find that the more a group knows, the more difficult it can be to actually listen openly, with the idea that you may gain new information that might shift your thinking. So listening with curiosity and an openness to learning and understanding. You've got a problem that you need to solve. And so really focusing on what is going to be a workable solution, knowing that whatever you develop is not going to be perfect, but something needs to be advanced, and it will be successful to a great degree. So adopting a problem-solving orientation, committing to working toward consensus so that we don't have outliers at the last minute just saying I can't buy into this, just voicing your concerns throughout the process so that we arrive at as much of a consensus as possible. All of the meeting materials, all of the meetings are public. Comments are on the record. There's always a video recording and some kind of cursory notes on our website that can be accessed through the Maine Climate Council website. And just to have some sense of humor and enjoy one another. It's nice to see people's faces when we're not able to see one another in person very much. So with that, let's see if everyone who is observing the meeting for now could mute yourselves just to eliminate background noise. And any initial questions before we get started with the content of the meeting? And you can just use raise hand function for now. Okay. All right. Well, let me then introduce Steve Sullivan, who is a principal property appraiser with the Property Tax Division at Maine Revenue Service. He's been kind enough to agree to provide an overview presentation of the Open Space Current Use Taxation Program. Joining him is Peter Lacey. Do we have Peter on the call yet?
I believe we do.
Okay. There you
I'm
go.
here, yes.
Hi, Peter.
How are you?
And I'm well. And Peter is the division director for the Property Tax Division, also with Maine Revenue Services, and can speak to, once we once Steve completes his presentation, or during, if you like, if you have questions that are sort of policy related, then Peter is available to answer those questions as well. So let me turn it over to Steve and to screen share and start his presentation.
Thank you. I'm just going to give you a brief overview of my background, then I'll start my presentation. I graduated from the University of Maine Forest Management, and it's going to be my 40th anniversary this year. For the last 21 years, I've been working in real estate appraisal and assessing, and 5 years with the state and the Bureau. So let me see if I can do this, and we'll show my presentation. There we go. And so, as I mentioned, I'm with Maine Revenue Services, Property Tax Division, and we have our contact information here. All of the information that we have is available on our website, and that's listed. And I am here to talk about the open space, farm and open space category. Technically, I'm going to talk about the open space component of that. It was enacted in 1971 by the legislature, and the reference is Title 36 and sections 1101 to 1121. And it was declared it was in the public interest to encourage preservation in order to conserve natural resources and prevent the forced conversion of farm and open space land to more intensive uses because of economic pressures on the land, particularly property tax. As part of your packet, I know that Jody gave you a bulletin that covers the open space program. That was updated just yesterday. And the new bulletin is on our website. I've included a link there just to show it. There were no policy changes as such in the update. It was merely just to make language more consistent with other publications throughout MRS. So on to open space, and it wouldn't be an MRS, program without having a slide that is a graph. So we'll start right off with one. And this shows the open space acreage statewide, and it is by the year, and we could see it starts in 1978 and goes to 2019. We did have a high of 135,609 acres, and that was in 2015. Right now, we are at 125,664 acres. We do not break out that by category of open space. It is a large number. It's just an aggregate of all acreage within the category. The municipal valuation return that we have does not have the ability to break that out at this time. And I think the last time that any data was collected in that way was in 2011. So I don't have any statistics on how this open space breaks out by category. This slide will show you the acreage by county. We can see that Hancock County has the largest number of acres in open space, with Piscataquis being the lowest. The valuation statewide of open space land is billion, 171,632,851 dollars. That is compared to a total state valuation of taxable property in the state of Maine of 176 trillion, 176 billion. Is that right? 176 billion. I'm sorry, way too many zeros. 176 billion, 176 million dollars in total valuation. So
I think, Steve, you're frozen.
open space value. This slide is to show. Oh, my internet is unstable, it says, so I'm sorry if I'm cutting in and out.
We're hearing you now, so you go right ahead. And then
All right.
worst case scenario, you may need to stop screen sharing, in which case sort of go through your presentation where you're seeing your slides, but the rest of us are not. But for now, why don't we still keep trying?
Okay. All right. Again, this is the percentage of open space by county. That gives a better feel for how much of a given county is in open space. And we can see that Saginaw County has the most by percentage in open space. Total across the state, it is 0.55% land in open space. And Saginaw County is the highest with 1.88% of the county. And the value within Saginaw County is 0.23%. So again, a very small number there. Open space is land that's preserved or restricted in use to provide a public benefit. And those are in conserving scenic resources, enhancing public recreation, promoting game management, and preserving wildlife or wildlife habitat. As far as requirements for the open space category, there is no minimum size to the open space category, unlike tree growth or farmland. There is a maximum size limit in the farm and open space category. An individual cannot have more than 15,000 acres statewide. That could play into the ability of some organizations to take part in the open space category. The Nature Conservancy, for instance, I looked at the website and they have 2.4 million acres in the state of Maine, and in whatever parts of their process they have those. Obviously, that exceeds that maximum size. The use must be preserved or restricted to provide a public benefit, and you cannot have any developed part of the parcel in the open space category. That plays into, I saw an open space application for a golf course in a town, and the assessor there denied that application based on the fact that it was pretty well developed as a golf course. As far as the public benefit factors, the assessor has to consider all facts and circumstances regarding the land and the vicinity of the property. A single factor, and there's a list that's in the bulletin and it's also in the legislation, whether it's listed or not in that list can determine a public benefit. So for instance, if you're talking about carbon sequestration that's not in the list. It was not seen as something that would be a public benefit when the legislature enacted this. So we expect that to be seen as a public benefit now. It could be used to in your application. There are public benefits. They're listed in the bulletin. I'm not going to read them all to you. I'm sure that you can all read, and I don't think you want to hear me drone on about A through P here as far as public benefits. But we can see that some of them are size and uniqueness of the landscape feature, opportunity for recreational or educational use. In previous presentations, item number F, which is the preservation will provide economic benefit by reducing public expenditure. Emphasis was placed on that. That is not part of the legislation. There's no emphasis in statute for that, and our bulletin does not include that. It is equal to all of the other public benefits that are possible throughout this. So I'm not going to stress it. I'm not going to, that's just, it was stressed before, but it is not part of the program. It's not, does not receive any preference. And again, we can see more. These just continue on. Existence of habitat for rare, endangered, or threatened species. And then finally, we get down to a written management plan agreement with IF&W, agriculture, conservation, and forestry, or land that's maintained in accordance with criteria adopted under a local ordinance. And those are all public benefits. They can all be considered. Others outside of this list can be considered. And the process for filing, you apply to the local assessor before April 1st. April 1st is the date for everything as far as taxation goes that throughout the state, except for now that we're in COVID, because of course that changes everything, but hopefully that will go away soon. The application has to include a map of the property, which outlines all of the open space categories and any developed parts of the property, so that you can get proper acreages involved in the application. You must include a statement from a professional forester if you are going to use a managed forest land category. And the assessor must notify you by June 1st of the decision on the classification. At that time, he can deny or approve the application. If they do deny it, he has to state the reason why they have denied the application and give the landowner the ability to amend that application to comply with the law. If they are still denied, it's like any other tax, property tax. They do have the right to an appeal. The appeal takes place for 100. You have that right for 185 days after the date of the taxes are committed for the municipality. With that application, you apply to the local assessor. They can approve or deny the abatement request or the appeal. They have 60 days to do that. If they don't respond within 60 days, it's deemed denied. And at that point, if you receive a denial or it's been deemed denied by time, you have the right to further appeal. And in the current use category, that appeal is made to the State Board of Property Tax Review. And they would then review your application and determine it on its merits, whether or not your appeal was justified. Categories of the open space, we're looking at ordinary open space. All open space within this application would fall in this category. Everything starts out as ordinary open space. Basically land that is permanently protected forever wild. All of those categories start here. It may or may not qualify for additional qualification discounts, but it always qualifies for this discount. We then move on to public access to open space. This is a further benefit. It can be added onto the ordinary open space. The applicant may permit, but it's not obligated to permit as a condition of qualification here, hunting, snowmobiling, overnight use, or anything like that. Public access in this case can be limited to daytime, non-motorized, non-destructive public use. And there is the ability for the landowner to limit that public use in case of protecting fragile resources. For instance, during mud season, you decide to close your property to public access during mud season. You can protect the public from hazardous conditions. If you were operating in the forest, you could limit the public access during that time. Those do not limit the public access portion of open space. Beyond that, we have permanently protected open space. This is land that is subject to a restriction, such as a permanent conservation easement, or it's held by a third party, or also a nonprofit entity can own this property, then that is their stated goal, so they can fall under permanently protected open space. Forever Wild goes further. It's land that's permanently protected, and it is committed to remaining unaltered in the state, except for, again, fishing or hunting, harvesting shellfish in the intertidal zone, prevention of spread of fire or disease, and the opportunity for low impact outdoor recreation. So we would expect camping, hiking, things like that. No developed campsites, primitive camping. And then another category, and the final one, is managed forest open space. It can be ordinary land, it can be permanently protected, can have public access. It doesn't have to have any of those, but it starts out as ordinary open space, and it is managed by a forest management plan. The plan must be in place and it must be updated every 10 years. The one thing to note is, obviously, if you're going to manage your forest, it is not possible for it to also be forever wild. The two are mutually exclusive. Valuation of open space, and this becomes kind of a really tricky part of the whole thing. We have two methods that we allow for the valuation of open space by statute. One is the value of the open space based on a sale price that parcel would command in the open market if it was required to remain in that category as part of the sale of the land. The sale of open space does not constitute a withdrawal. So if you have open space land and you wish to sell it, you can do that. There is no forced withdrawal at that point unless you change the use of the property or wish to do it voluntarily. So the restriction runs with the land, and therefore there may or may not be a reduced value to that in the market. So the valuation problem here becomes finding enough data that allows you to extract from the market what the effect is of having open space on your property. And that is fairly complex. The ability of a local assessor to do that type of valuation problem might be limited. We deal with a lot of people who are selectmen assessors. They're not trained assessors, they're not professionals. So they may find this type of valuation beyond their abilities. It could be seen that the responsibility to prove this could fall to the landowner, that they would have to provide an appraisal by a competent individual to prove that value. That is one avenue that could be involved. It's certainly out there. Probably the most common method is the alternative valuation method. It's a little bit simpler for most assessors to deal with, particularly those that are not full-time assessors. And that is based on a reduction of the assessed value of the property prior to open space. And we can see the reductions here. Ordinary open space would receive a 20% reduction. Again, they are cumulative. So you can add on public access, which is a 25% reduction. So now you're talking about a 45% reduction. And you can add them all up. If you add all of them together that could be there, forever wild, public access, permanently protected, ordinary open space, we're talking about a 95% reduction in tax. If you were doing it with a managed forest, then you would be talking of a possible reduction of 85%. And it can vary anywhere, again, from that 20% original all the way up to 95, depending on what category you fall under. Now, to give you an idea on this, in Washington County, that's an area that I'm particularly familiar with, my area, one of my areas that I work with extensively. For state valuation purposes, we look at undeveloped acreage in Washington County to be at $465 an acre. that's a non-coastal town. A 30% reduction for an ordinary open space managed forest would mean that your value would be $325 an acre. And we can see that that's higher than the tree growth rates right now in Washington County. Washington County right now, the highest is $152 an acre. So there could be a possibility there that the landowner could appeal and ask to be valued at the tree growth rates, because one of the things about forested land is that it cannot be valued at less than the tree growth value. So even though you get 85% reduction, if the town was at a $200 per acre, and I've seen that for undeveloped acreage, then you can't go below that $152 maximum on the tree growth. As far as transfers, anywhere within any of the current use programs, there's no penalty to move from tree growth to open space, or open space to farmland, or open space to tree growth. As long as you remain within a current use program, there is no penalty. What you could see is, for instance, someone who is in tree growth and they sell off a parcel that doesn't meet the 10-acre minimum. That land could then be put in open space with no penalty. It's just one way of avoiding that penalty and maintaining it in a current use program. Forest management plans, again, are just like tree growth. They are required, and they have to be updated every 10 years by a professional forester. There is a provision that allows the local assessor to request a copy of the management plan, to enter the property and review whether or not it's complying with the management plan. And then it could be, again, you must comply with this, or we will withdraw you from the open space and assess a penalty. Penalties, anytime that you transfer from tree growth to another open space category, if you then withdraw from that, so you move to farmland, if you withdraw from the farmland program within 10 years, the penalty will default back to the tree growth penalty. Particularly in the farmland, the penalty for withdrawal from tree growth is greater than the penalty withdrawing from farmland. Initialist responsibilities, again, you have to apply for it by April 1st, provide a map, you have to comply with a forest management plan, and you have to present a copy of that management plan upon request. You must notify the assessor for any change in use for any of the current use categories. Failure to do so can result in a higher penalty upon withdrawal. And that's it as far as my slides.
Awesome.
Be happy to take any questions at this point.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. And I also wanted to note that pages 2 through 12 of your meeting packet include additional background information on the open space program, some material from the website, and a comparative table that Don Mancius was kind enough to put together that just shows the primary differences between tree growth, farmland, and open space. And then beyond that, beyond the bulletin, which, as we just learned, is can be found in an updated format on the Maine Revenue Service site, is just some information about 2019 and the valuation statistics. So let me open it up for questions for Steve or for Peter. And, you know, I think ultimately where this is driving toward is, do you as task force members have initial thoughts on how the open space program could be modified to better serve carbon storage objectives. So just keep that in the back of your mind, and I'll take Tom Doak. Go ahead. And then Karen. You're on mute.
I've got probably 4, but I'll take one and then if somebody else can. So can you talk about the impact of current use taxation on valuation in a town and impact on revenue sharing? Because one of the issues is, a loss of tax revenue for a municipality, but doesn't that also lower the valuation in the town so that actually some of that is offset by revenue sharing? Is that a fair statement?
Like anything in property tax, the answer is perhaps. As far as state valuation, we round valuation to the nearest $50,000. So if you make a change in open space that is less than that, it doesn't affect state valuation at all. Depending on the individual municipality and how it's classified and a whole myriad of things, putting it in open space may not reduce state valuation. It might not. It's, again, how was it taxed before? How do we treat the undeveloped acreage and all of those things? So they may not reduce your state valuation. It may.
Current use broadly does, though. I mean, if you're talking about not just open space, but current use, like all of the current use programs combined, are going to result in a lower valuation for the town.
So I guess my point was, there's reimbursement for tree growth, but you keep hearing about open space would be a big, more people in open space would be a big tax loss to the town. And I understand there would be an impact, but some of that would be potentially offset by the fact there's a lower valuation. And would you have any specific, do you get that information from a town so you could say open space resulted in this much reduction in valuation, so it affected the revenue sharing by X in a town? Do you have that kind of information?
No, because we don't. So all we do is we produce the state valuation numbers, and then they go to Secretary of State, and the treasurer and education are doing those calculations in terms of how much revenue sharing is going to be, how much education funding is going to be. So we don't have a real good. I don't have a strong idea of what. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio, certainly, because the particularly for education, there's different calculations for different towns. So yes, there's going to be a benefit. We don't have numbers on what that would be, though.
I think for our purpose.
Tom, let me take Karen and then Tom Abello and then circle back to you, Tom Doak.
I'm fine if Tom wants to keep going, or should I?
We have a couple of other folks who also have questions. So
Right.
do you have a question yourself, Karen?
I do. So I was curious about the provision that you mentioned, that if there was a written management agreement with IF&W or Department of Ag, Conservation and Forestry, that could be that could help meet the criteria for open space. So my question is could you give some examples of what those might involve? And I think the deeper question, which maybe is more for discussion, is, if we were to be thinking about ideas relating to amending open space where a landowner was to perform some beneficial forest management for carbon, you probably don't want to further burden the town tax assessor with going out in the field and verifying it, but could a written agreement with, say, the Maine Forest Service suffice? So I was just trying to learn a little bit more about what those written management agreements look like.
as far as that goes, I think like a management plan that would be used by IFW to promote woodcock habitat, something like that. Nesting habitat for birds, any of those. And I'm not sure of specific ones. I've never run into one in my particular area that I've seen. I know that they're out there, but that's the type of management plan that would fall in that category.
Thanks. Peter, do you have thoughts? Any other thoughts? On
Yeah,
that?
that's basically what it is. My understanding anyway of what it is that it's the IF&W will sometimes do these agreements with landowners for particular wildlife habitats. And it may be for specific species or something along those lines, but I personally have never seen one either, but that's my understanding of them. So.
Okay, great. We have a number of people who have questions. Tom Abello, why don't you go next and then Mark?
Thanks, Jody. Is there a way to determine if any of the buckets are being underutilized now in the program? So I know you didn't have the data when you showed the acreage numbers, but is there a way to determine most people are in forest management or most people are in their forever wild sections? Can we break that out in some way?
I think we'd have to add lines for MVR or something to do that. Because the thing to keep in mind with these programs too is that they're administered on the municipal level. So the municipalities, with the exception of the unorganized territory, which we handle, the municipalities are the ones that are accepting the applications and reviewing the documentation and, approving these current use programs. So there's no kind of central database of all of this data. So we collect on our MVR, as Steve mentioned, data on just open space broadly, but not by category. So that would require some type of outreach to actually get that data.
Yeah, thank you. Mark, go ahead, and then I'm gonna, unless you're very upset about this, Tom Doe, because you did have your hand up, I'm thinking of jumping over you to get Patrick and Ryan as well to get a bunch of voices in the room. But let me take Mark.
Thanks, Jody. Stephen, my question was around the practical approach to the limitation that the open space reduction can't be greater than the tree growth reduction. And I think I heard you say something that would indicate I was sort of understanding that wrong. Is it that the open space reduction can't be greater than the maximum tree growth reduction by county? Is that how it's done in practice?
The reduction in open space can be lower than the tree growth value.
Right, but
However,
most landowners that are in open space not actually have the data to say what their tree growth bill would be?
If your land is in the managed forest part of tree growth, so you're qualifying for that additional amount, then you cannot be lower than the tree growth value. It is the potential if you had a field that you had protected, permanently protected, forever wild, and et cetera, those values could be less than tree growth. But the forested managed land can never be less than the tree growth values.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Only applies to lands that enroll with the managed forest category?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And again, they're going to present a management plan that would include a stand type map so that you could assess it based on that stand type.
Thanks, I got it.
Thank you. Patrick, you go ahead. And then Patrick and then Ryan.
Hey, Steve, how you doing?
Hi, Patrick. We were at school at the same time.
Yes, it's been a while, but we're still young at heart. Steve, I was this is along the lines of what I was getting at as well, as a policy point of view, that we don't want to be creating an incentive to slide out of tree growth easily. My mills wouldn't like that. It's, and we don't want to have a mass exodus, although I probably have a few million acres after this legislative session that would be glad to slide out of tree growth. But from a policy point of view, you said in Washington County, you can approach the tree growth level under this program. But as you get to more affluent communities where land values are higher, I think, is there a general trend towards an increasing difference between tree growth and backlot values that gets you further from being able to approach tree growth rates? Is that your understanding, or how would we get at that?
If you were in Cumberland or York County, for instance, I would assume that their undeveloped acreage rates are great enough that by being an open space under the alternative valuation method, you would not reach tree growth rates, because you'd be looking at that 20% and then 10% and then 85%. And if you're at right now, their rates are about 400, and please don't hold me to total value. I don't work down there. It's 430 something an acre is the maximum, 450 and something like that. So if you were looking at a coastal community in New York and Cumberland County, and you get the maximum 85%, you might not reach that $450 rate. It could be still of benefit to you to be in the tree growth program as opposed to being in an open space.
Yeah,
and it's important to remember that penalty for withdrawing remains at the tree growth rate for 10 years.
Right, right.
The farther south you get, the gap between the undeveloped acreage and the tree growth rate widens considerably.
Right.
The farther south and more coastal you get, just because of, property values for waterfront in Cumberland County is different than property values for undeveloped land in, Millinocket or Fort Fairfield or whatever. So,
I looked at the undeveloped for coastal Cumberland County, and the value we use for state valuation purposes, that's not the same as what the communities use, but we use $4,200 an acre there.
Let me take Ryan, Tom Doak, and then I think we're going to need to pivot to the next part of our agenda.
Hey, thanks, Jody. I just wanted to weigh in relative to the discussion about habitat management agreements or plans between IF&W and landowners that may or may not be enrolled in open space. And I'm not aware of any management agreements we've developed specifically for parcels that may be included into open space. Typically, our habitat management agreements have been with larger landowners that would be excluded by the 15,000 acre cap relative to the program. So I just wanted to provide that information.
Great, thank you. Go ahead, Tom. Sorry if you still.
Jody, sorry. But Steve, did I catch that you had mentioned there was a breakdown by category in open space done in 2011? Or did I hear that incorrectly?
There was one done at that point, but it was not by acreage. It looks to be, when I looked at the data, it looked like it was by number of parcels. So that's really kind of, if I have a parcel that's 100,000 and it gets the same weight as a parcel that's 10. So it's really not, it wouldn't be the way that I would assess or look at that figure.
Great. So let's see, Tom Doak, do you still recall the questions you had?
Yeah, I have a couple. I'll try to be quick. Just to finish my first comment about valuation, I think for our purposes, we should have some way of identifying the impact of people if we're going to expand open space, we ought to be able to say it isn't a complete 100% reduction to the town and taxes. So I don't know how we would do that, but getting some examples would be, I think, really useful. Patrick and I would disagree, I think, on the policy issues around, I believe that someone ought to be able to go from tree growth to open space if they want. They can now, but there's no guarantee. I don't think just because the previous owner got in tree growth, that they should be locked in there if they want. I think a landowner would be able to choose the program they want. My one comment is, I think that one of the limitations on open space is tree growth is a guarantee. If you meet certain characteristics, you must be put in. If you're in farmland, you meet certain things, you must qualify. Open space, there's a long list of things to consider, but there's no guarantee. And that's one of the limitations, I would say, on open space. The uncertainty of whether someone qualifies is an issue that has not been addressed.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say is, this law hasn't been looked at in a long time, and I'm trying to figure out if it's permanently protected. The valuation is already so substantially reduced that why would you be in the program if you're already permanently protected? Do you get a percentage reduction off the value that's permanently protected? Or is it as if it weren't permanently protected and then reduced? Do you know my question, Steve?
I understand what you're saying. And again, that's a local assessing question that we don't really have any data for. I couldn't tell you that there is a reduction for permanently protected land out there.
Okay.
And again, we run into that problem again of how do we determine what that reduction is? That's a relatively complex valuation problem.
One of the issues then, I think, is if we were going to update open space, we don't really know how much those categories are being used. But it would seem to me if you're permanently protected, you already got the reduction, and that might not be one that you need to keep. But I'm not sure how. Nobody knows how much that's used then.
I think the other thing I would point out that's kind of hovering in the background too is the Maine Law Court's decision in Francis Small Heritage Trust, which came out in 2014, in which they said that certain land trusts can qualify as charitable and benevolent and be completely exempt.
Right.
So I think that should just kind of be in the background of your heads, because there has been, I think, some transition from open space to just flat out exempt, or new stuff coming in being brought in as exempt. So,
and that first slide where I showed the total land in tree growth showed that dip. That dip that occurred was right after that Francis Small versus Leamington.
Yeah, I'm thinking about private owners, that might have a conservation easement on it or something like that. And if you've got that, you've already got a reduction in valuation locally. You should have. So I'm not sure whether you can then get the percentage reduction off that reduction in your valuation. That seems like really triple dipping.
So Tom, I'm gonna need to cut the conversation, or at least take a pulse. We could, if we want, and Steve and Peter were willing, ask them to remain for a while longer while you move on to your next agenda item, which is really a broader conversation around forest practices. Whether you have such burning additional questions about open space, to ask them to remain on, we could do that. But I do think we need to shift to sort of a deep dive into the meeting materials that you were provided on forest practices. Mark, is this sort of a suggestion in reference to this? Go right ahead.
Yeah, I think we need time to discuss potential revisions to the open space program, and that's not the time that you have on this meeting's agenda.
Yeah.
But I think it would be helpful if we could invite Steve and Peter to join us again, when we return to this conversation.
How does that sound to the rest of you? Tom, if you want to build, are you building on that, Tom?
Yeah,
go right ahead.
I would like to just briefly. I think that's a good idea. And in the interim, we've already flagged a couple of challenges or potential issues here. Maybe we can have the group email you directly, Jody, any thoughts or additional limitations that we see, so that for the next meeting, we can start with those conversations.
That's great. Okay, well then why don't we take this time to just simply thank Steve and Peter, let them continue on with their day, likely circle back to you in the coming month or two. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. And yeah, we're more than willing to, be there as a resource if you guys need us in the future. So,
Perfect. All right. Thank you.
thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So because a couple of, well, one of you has already had to leave, and I've texted that individual, and another one has to leave at 11. What I wanted to do is just insert here the homework assignment that I think could be helpful to you moving forward. And that is that between now and 2 weeks from now, so Friday, April 16th as a deadline, if each of you could review the meeting materials, both from today and from the prior meeting, and think about, pull any sort of salient points from either of these two meetings that you think would be critical elements or really helpful elements of a forest carbon program. So last meeting, it was all about what are some of the demographics of landowners, what are some of their preferences around why they manage their land, and think about some of that information, how it could be central to or relevant to how you would design a program. It could just be bullets. So I'm just making this up, but if you had a bullet like, we really should be focusing on landowners that have more than 50 acres, focusing more of our attention there because of the numbers of parcels or the shape of the land ownership in Maine, or we should be focusing more on a particular practice. We should make sure that there's a particular forest practice based on what you will be talking about today that seems really vital, given how much it is known to have the potential to store additional carbon, that really should be an element. So I just want to hear basic bullets. It can be very rough, but by getting this on paper, my concern is that as you're building knowledge over these meetings, I don't want you to lose the things that you find to be fairly central to the conversation from 2 meetings ago. I will compile those bullets, see if there are themes, and I will give them back to you in a summarized manner for the next meeting as part of your meeting materials. I'll send an email out to you after this meeting to sort of summarize what I'm looking for, but I just wanted to make sure before Melissa, I think, has to jump off the line, that you were all aware of that exercise. Shouldn't take you a long time. So please don't spend a huge amount of time on it. With that, then, I was going to just open this up for a fairly broad conversation about the materials from page 13, almost to the end of your packet. It ends at, I'd say, page 23 or 24. Nope, 28. And start to get some reactions from you, in particular about some of the more there were maybe 2 or 3 documents in particular in this packet that I think did a very good job of summarizing forest practices that are already well understood to result in a large degree of carbon storage. And they were produced by, a number of organizations. And I really just want to start getting your reactions to what jumped out to you as important from those materials.
I'll jump in here. You're talking about the climate smart forest management practices draft. Yeah.
From that point on, yeah.
There's lots of listings of desirable practices that will sequester carbon, long-term sustainable forest management practices, the excellent forestry from NEP. My question and concern is, how are these quantified so that we know how the carbon is indeed being sequestered, and how are they verified, especially if it's going to be going into, an open space tax category or something like that. I don't think we need to really reinvent the wheel about coming up with a list of what good practices are, because I think there's plenty of it around. I think it's really, the quantifying and perhaps different levels of some landowners are going to be doing more than others. And how does that fit into the program? So I guess this is really more questions than answers, but just something for us to think about.
Well, there are questions, but I also think they could be sort of fundamental criteria that you may gravitate as a group toward those practices that you know to be more easily quantifiable or more accurately quantifiable and verifiable. So I think it's helpful. Mark, go ahead.
This is less a reaction to receiving the materials and more a thought as we were thinking about what to include, but strikes me, and I think is worth all of us keeping in mind, that some of these resources, and in particular, I think, noting the list of strategies from NIACS and the adaptation workbook, the set that's specifically focused on mitigation, just that others have done a lot of work with stakeholders to organize thinking around possible strategies. And I would encourage us not to start from scratch and create something completely new in that regard, but rather to align with and draw from some of the resources that we have available. And I would say I think it is an if we actually put forward something that does have restrictions on strategies.
Oh, I see. Patrick, go right ahead.
My only thought is that the thing I'll be watching for is that we don't create small standards of acceptable practice that are going to put us in conflict with how we manage commercial forests. So that's some of the lens I'm looking through. I know we're talking about smaller acreages, but we're also going to be putting the label on these recommendations that these are climate smart activities. So I think I'll keep trying to think that way. It's not about just small landowners. We're talking about land practices, which will be used as a lens to judge all landowners. So just random thought, I guess.
Mark, I wonder if you wanted to expand on this distinction a little bit more that you just raised around the idea of advancing a program that delineates practices versus one that doesn't, and make sure that the group fully understands that decision-making point, and maybe describe, and we'll obviously get into this in more detail at the next meeting, talking about actual programs that are in place and how they're designed, but just sort of describe a little bit about the architecture of the two branches of programs.
I'll try. And I would say that, as I think about our work in this task force and, a program, I envision that it might actually have completely separate components, such as a revision of the open space current use tax law, such as a technical assistance program, and potentially such as a financial incentive that is in some way managed through the state. And we could take different approaches in those different boxes. But to Barry's point about measurement or verification of outcomes, in the broader realm of forest carbon incentives, there are some approaches that rely entirely on measurement and tracking of outcomes at the level of an individual participant or parcel, and others that rely on implementation of particular practices at the level of an individual participant or parcel. And the outcomes in that case may be evaluated across the entire program as a whole. And I would, suggest that as we think about smaller landowners, we not be too tightly wed to the idea that we need to monitor specific carbon outcomes from specific parcels, but rather think about a program that will tend to have a climate benefit overall. That's at least a choice for us to consider as we go forward. And we could monitor the outcome of a program at a programmatic level rather than at an individual parcel or individual participant level. So that's, I guess, a big part of how I'm thinking about it. And I would say that, for me, as I think about the type of program or programs that we want to put forward, I keep in mind that one of our concerns is maintaining forest cover. And in some cases, we may put forward an incentive like the open space program and the tree growth program. Their primary value may be in helping landowners keep forest as forest. And even if that is their primary value, that is a climate benefit. It's reducing forest loss and it's maintaining opportunity for carbon sequestration. So I take a pretty broad view of how we can benefit the climate with a program for small landowners. I'll leave it there and hope that was helpful with what you were looking for.
Thank you. Yes. Karen, go ahead, and then Alec.
I know we keep getting drawn into talking about the mechanisms and what the program would look like, but just for a little bit longer, I would like to get a sense, certainly there are quite a few practices that were listed in the materials, and would love to get a sense from folks if there's some that really seem basic and central and very where there's a lot of comfort with how they could work in Maine and work for this landowner group that we're focused on. I understand, Pat, your concern there, and so maybe are there some that you see as being particularly valuable that wouldn't sort of wash into the larger landowner category? In other words, are there some, and I've had many conversations with some of you about, which ones really are, logical, pre-commercial thinning, for example, and there's some that really seem to bump up in all the lists. So, are there a handful that really do seem to be basic and helpful that could be brought into some kind of either single program or a package of programs?
Before I
Really
take
appreciate that.
Alec, Karen, do you have a perspective on that yourself? You have yourself a lot of knowledge, and I'm wondering if there are some that jumped out to you.
There are, but I guess maybe this could be part of our homework. If folks could be thinking about the top 5 that seem really applicable to this landowner size group that might have those either verifiable and quantifiable qualities, or could be brought into a more participation type program. So, I would encourage some discussion around this, and maybe our homework includes that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. Alec, go right ahead. You're muted.
I don't want to derail Karen's, I think, excellent thought that we should try and identify those practices with the greatest potential. And, you know, in my mind, things like, particularly if there are markets for small diameter wood that we can, that either exist or we can create incentives for things like early commercial thinning in fully stocked or overstocked stands. And we have a lot of them. I think would really bear fruit. Likewise, I think sort of the general category of far more intensive forest management that increases rates of productivity, speeds up growth, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll just offer those as a couple of initial thoughts and welcome the homework assignment that Karen has suggested. The other point that I wanted to make is, and this is kind of building off of Mark's comment about different ways to design programs. So Karen, forgive me, I'm getting back into mechanisms here. But you could set up a program that pays landowners for practices that you have determined a priori are going to have carbon benefits. So you can figure out, for example, if somebody does an early commercial thinning and there's a market for the material, what the carbon benefits of that are, and you can calculate hence some amount of money that they should be paid for those activities.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, then, barring any major objection, why don't we circle back to Karen's point a moment ago and just hear about specific practices that any of you think are most promising to this size landowner group.
This is Barry. I second the discussion of the pre-commercial and like early commercial thinning as a way of increasing sequestration and also something that would appeal to landowners. Most of the landowners that I work with, forest health is something they're really, it's like their basic primary concern. They don't quite know what it is or what it means, but it's something that's really important to them. So we have lots of discussions and how to work on something like that. And I think pre-commercial thinning is one way to do that. And while I had the floor, I just wanted to address some of Pat's concerns a little while ago about how any spillover effect might come to larger landowners based on anything we do here. I think that the data that Tom showed in the last presentation showed a very marked difference between the objectives of larger landowners and smaller landowners. I think, larger landowners are definitely engaged in managing their land and don't need to be convinced to do it. And I think smaller landowners really do. And one thing that came out in the discussion, the last meeting was that, if you're going to be talking about cutting trees, they don't want to hear about it. But if you're talking about forest health or birds or carbon or something like that, you're going to be actually reaching landowners and opening up land that previously wasn't. So in that sense, they could be actually a benefit to industry by, kind of opening up some lands that the doors are closed now, and you're opening them in the guise of carbon, and is what we're talking about now. So I just wanted to put those thoughts out.
Awesome. Thank you. Ryan, go ahead. And then
Real
Tom
quick.
Doak.
I'd second Barry and Alex's discussion about the thinnings to retain more forest carbon as a one of the practices that's I feel is important. I also think that the control of invasive species, especially for this size landowner group, is important. Southern and central Maine My opinion is that invasives do have the ability to impact those forest resources over time, and really can restrict the management opportunities that are available to landowners. So I think that is should be a focus of this as well.
Great, thank you. Tom, and then Stacy.
A couple of things. I think, there's a really good model out there already with the NRCS cost share programs, and, like there's pre-commercial thinning available there, and, you could look at, what counts as a commercial thinning now depends everything on markets. But if you had enough of a rate, you could get some of the work done on, the pre-commercial side. If the rate is high enough and there's somebody that wants to do the work. The other part of that is, how do you have enough volume so that somebody wants to get into that business? The other thing, it's not really a practice, but I really think, the technical assistance part is really, and the nice thing about the practice is, there's a system by which it's checked, here's the standard, and a forester certifies it. So you've got that kind of, this is the standard. Was it met? A forester certifies it. So that's a process already in place. The technical, providing the technical assistance in general is, I still think is going to be one of the biggest benefits here in some way, that if somehow increase the technical assistance that's available to that huge group of landowners who want to do things but don't know what to do.
Stacy, go ahead.
Am I unmuted? Yeah. Okay. So I just find my head spinning. I don't know what you guys are thinking, but it seems to be like the more we learn, the more possibilities there are and the more options. And so I'm trying to think about this in a way that's a little bit more organized, I guess. And I really liked what Karen said about trying to identify, because the way I'm starting to wrap my head around this is to try to figure out, well, what do we need to happen? Like, what are the biggest practices that would have the biggest impact on stored carbon? And then trying to figure out who our target would be for those practices, what type of landowner, because it's not going to be one size fits all, right? And then how do we incentivize that type of landowner to participate? And then once we get a kind of a bunch of those scenarios, then we can kind of pool those together and create a program around that. But I think that it all starts with what Karen mentioned with, what is it that we need to happen? What are these best practices? And we might not be able to hit all of them, or maybe we can pull some of them together. They're common enough. And I am definitely not an expert in that area. So I don't know what the most impactful practices would be, but it seems like a really good place to start. That's it.
Yeah, good way to structure it. I'm just wanting to point out the chat that's going on at the same time, and just, suggest that periodically you all look at that to see whether it sparks further thinking. It's fairly substantive. And go ahead, Karen.
So the other sort of flip side, are there some practices that are concerning? And I'm saying this, having participated a bit in, I participated in the Natural and Working Lands group, and I sensed that there was some discomfort with the concept of having increased stocking standards, for example, as a way to arrange a program. And so I learned a lot listening to people and tried to understand, where different perspectives would have issues. And so, this is a very good group of people, and we're fortunate to have Jody helping us. So, let's also, identify areas of discomfort, and so that we use our time well to focus on practices that are identifiable, that could be a core of a program, knowing there are a lot of things out there that are happening through existing programs, but is there something we can do that's beneficial and additive, but isn't hurting and, do no harm? So maybe as part of our homework, people would be asked to identify areas they would prefer this program not go to.
I am wanting to make sure that we give all of the materials, sort of their due justice. And I'm wondering whether it would be useful, totally open to your direction here, to, look at one document at a time for a short period of time, to hone in on it and see, a little bit with, I think, Karen's lens of things that seem highly compelling to you and things that don't seem relevant, or you can't see their usefulness in the state of Maine for any number of reasons. Would you find that helpful? And I think we could get through it quickly and we have the time, but I don't want to go in that direction if you wouldn't find it useful. Seeing one nodding head and not a lot else. Okay. I'm going to make an executive decision then that we do that, so that we're sure that we've given the materials done justice to them, and pull forward anything that seems highly compelling. So if you were to turn to page 13 and look at pages 13 through 15 first, and these are the climate smart forest management practices that were put together by NIAC's, a NIAC group essentially focused on Southern New England. And some of these may just not feel relevant to the Northern New England. So let's just, kind of popcorn style shout out things that seemed important or didn't seem important to you.
I just note that we've already heard the first two. So we've already heard avoiding forest loss and removing competing vegetation come up as important.
Yep. Karen, you had?
I was going to say the same thing, that, maybe a building block for this group would be mentioning, having those as two really important.
Great. Well, then let's turn to page 14 then, since those two items were the only ones on 13.
So some that have already come up there, the idea of extended cutting cycles. I don't know if we specifically talked about it today, but we have talked about it earlier. That's often the first one that comes to mind. The idea of establishing forest reserves. So the forever wild, in my mind, is some way is sort of a form of that through open space. And then we also talked about retain more carbon in thinnings to some degree.
Mm-hmm. Anything else there, or the inverse, things that concern you? It's very clear to you that you wouldn't support it, or you don't think it's easily applicable to Maine's forests.
I guess one other thing I would note, the system that's being used there, the C and the A, the C is indicating the practices that are relevant to carbon benefits, and the A's, if it's only an A, are focused on adaptation. Doesn't mean it's irrelevant, because a resilient forest that adapts well there is some carbon benefit from that. But we've covered all of the ones that are listed as C's with what Adam just said, with the exception of protecting regeneration from browsing. And there may be places in the state where that's a relevant practice.
Have you covered create regeneration with complexity?
Oh, perhaps, yeah, perhaps not, but I would support it.
Patrick, go ahead. You're on mute.
Sometimes. I think extending cutting cycles is certainly of interest in growing larger trees, but it gives the wrong impression that there's a lot of work to thinning those stands and putting that growth on the larger trees. So it's not leaving the stands alone, it's managing them more intensively. I just wanted to differentiate between that. We want good annual increment growth rings, and that means weeding the site. It's not just delaying the harvest.
Patrick, would it be fair to say that that's an addition that really isn't on the list? You know, that thinning activity or crop tree release?
Well, you don't get larger trees unless you give them room to grow. Otherwise, you get pretty suppressed trees. So it's implicit probably, but it's not understood. I mean, you're not going to get bigger trees if you don't do anything in the stand. You're going to have tiny little growth rings. You want to keep trees growing. And so getting bigger trees means active management fast.
I understand what you're saying there. And I think this is where there's benefit to bridge our documents. I think Alec has that in his document that's
right. Yeah.
Next on our list. It just wasn't as explicit in this list.
Yep.
Okay, that's helpful. Alec, you go ahead. You're muted.
Okay, I'm not anymore. Anyway, I was just going to say that I would support Mark's suggestion that that ought to be explicitly understood, that you can accelerate the growth rates even of fairly big old trees, demonstrated by some studies that have been done if you thin them to release the residuals.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, helps maintain your harvest levels, which means that you're really accomplishing something for the atmosphere by maintaining harvest and increasing growth rates.
Great. Okay, well, why don't we move on to page 15? Seeming perhaps less relevant, but maybe not. What's your reactions? Yeah, go ahead, Patrick.
I was following the train of thought on planting, and I hadn't thought about it, but I do think, you know, there are a lot of older plantations in small woodlot owners that were done back during the cost sharing days. And we know those to be fairly productive carbon storing sites, but do we run up against conflict with agriculture land, or if land is really, how do we deal with that? Because it is obvious that planting would be a good kind of activity of small landowners. So I wanted to bring that thread of conversation up a little bit.
So Patrick, I can respond to that somewhat. I've done a recent study with colleagues throughout the US that has looked at that. And we have identified close to 400,000 acres in Maine that are sort of deemed feasible for planting, but would not necessarily take any sort of primary agricultural land out of production. It's a lot of sort of marginal pasture and hay fields and stuff would be the primary source. So I'm happy to share some info on that. But it isn't like the more than 1 million acres that we have in agriculture. It's not necessarily that you would take that all out, but there's some spaces where it's not, at least in its current form, being super productive, that maybe there wouldn't be too much of a concern about competing land use and food security and things like that.
So Patrick, maybe when you do your homework, that might be an item that you could list as an element of a potential program. Why don't we move on, just in the spirit of paying attention to time and looking at the document that Alec was kind enough to develop at my request. And it's page 16 and 17, and get reactions to that list.
I'll say that I thought Alex highlighted components were all worth our consideration. I think some of the ones that he chose not to highlight, probably also would be lower priority for us to spend time on. But I appreciate what he pulled together here.
Great. I'm looking at a printout and I see nothing highlighted on my white page, so I'll go back to it and pull those. But I do recall them being there. Go ahead, Karen.
And this is a question, Alec, I think for you, but all of the practices looked of importance to perhaps us and a program, but the planting of genetically superior seeds, is that something that's easily incorporated into say a smaller landowner program? I'm just not as familiar with how landowners, maybe in this category of acreage, would avail themselves of that.
Yeah, so there's the issue of supply. Of where would you get such things? They do exist, but you'd have to make sure that they were available to people. This goes to some of the comments that were going back and forth between Andy Whitman and Adam in the chat, that the related to the dreaded word plantations, which I didn't use, but the practices that I laid out could be used in plantations, such as planting genetically superior trees. And the gains in terms of productivity, short rotations, carbon storage are very large if you go this direction. So for example, I understand that Irving has said that in their spruce plantations that they figure that they can grow wood 4 times faster than you could with, common practice. So you'd have to figure out where you can get, and they do use genetically superior trees that they grow themselves in their facilities. So you'd have to figure out how you made that how you got that kind of material available to small landowners.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts on any part of Alex's document?
Just that in the ACF committee yesterday, there was the agriculture, conservation, and forestry. This group was mentioned as a place that could look at soil, things that we could do with our soils to enhance carbon. And I didn't know what those were in a forested ecosystem, but Representative Osher brought it up and wanted this group to be thinking about that, whether the legislature directs us that way or not. But Ivan, your name may have come up in that discussion too, but it was just a topic of conversation for us to perhaps think about. I don't know what the answer is. I think our forested ecosystems are pretty buffered and durable, and I don't know how we, on landowner land that maybe we're planting to, from converting from old pasture land or poor forest to plantations. Maybe there's something in that. I don't know.
I see Mark's hand, but I did want to give Ivan you the opportunity to jump
Yeah,
in.
I think that's a sort of a different discussion in that context. You're going to lose soil carbon proportional to the degree of disturbance of the forest and whatever the practice is. And we can sort of constrain that, but we don't have concrete numbers like you do above ground. So it's worth considering relative to the practices and recommendations that come from this committee, but we're not there yet. So
Okay,
thanks.
thank you. Mark, go ahead.
Thanks, and thanks, Ivan. I was going to say something similar, that I think disturbance is the primary consideration. So with regard to soil carbon, it's more about caution about doing harm rather than opportunity to sort of artificially increase soil carbon somehow.
Got it.
To your question about the rest of Alec's document, I wanted to flag David Moskowitz's comment in the chat, pointing us to his graph on the second page, so page 17. And Alec could elaborate on that, but the upshot from a quick look at it is that practices, exemplary forestry practices, are the largest opportunity by this analysis. I would say that the opportunity to spread them depends somewhat on having forest to spread them in, and so retaining forest remains important, but it is a pretty compelling depiction of where the opportunity lies.
Sure. Yeah. That makes sense. Unless there's some nuance that you think is important, Alec, for us to pull from that, I might suggest that we move on with the 1 minute that we have remaining.
I liked a lot of Alec's stuff there. The graph is instructive. You've just got to put a cost to landowner return kind of analysis in there too.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, and we're trying to figure that out. And just briefly, and I know that Bob Seymour and others are big fans of this, most of that big wedge in the middle is from increasing the stocking on understocked lands.
Uh-huh. So if you could then turn to pages 18 and 19. This was originally going to be a 20-page insert because I had a paragraph description of each one of these items on page 19, each one of these strategies, and it just felt like too much. So I just wanted you to know that that information is available. If there are either strategies and bullets within each of those strategies that you're not quite sure what they mean and you're wondering if they have potential, or you think they are, you know what they're about, you think they're compelling and that we should be pulling that forward. But reactions to those pages in our time remaining would be helpful.
Jody, this is from the forest. What am I looking at? It's actually pages.
Oh, where does this come from?
No, is it pages 20 and 21 or?
I'm sorry, pages 18 and 19.
And I think Mark has put the link in too to the actual website, if it's easier to go to the website instead of the clip of the PDF.
And the advantage of that is it will provide you with the one paragraph about each bulleted sub-strategy if you want to read about it now or later.
Oh my.
I guess I would just say, there's obviously a huge amount of overlap between this list and the two documents we just covered. And I think that if we organize the practices that we've identified that we believe are relevant, we'll find that there are descriptions of each here that we could adapt for our purposes or use.
Yeah, really good point. Well, maybe the homework then for me is you know, obviously I will pull forward anything that's been raised on this call, and I can think about, and I'll get you in just one second, Karen, and I'll also think about whether it could be helpful to extract more detail on those practices immediately, or maybe, and once I get that homework back from you where you have individually identified program elements, be they practices or something else, I will summarize that. And if within that are raised new practices that we haven't really delved into, I can pull forward some further detail on those as well. Go ahead, Karen.
Well, and looking at this list that is that we've just been talking about on page 19, one or two things that did seem a little bit different that really hadn't come up were sort of avoiding disturbances like wildfire. We've mentioned invasives, but you know, just there's some perhaps practices there that can reduce loss of carbon. And then what, you know, post disturbance activity. And then the prioritized management of locations that provide high carbon value was one that intrigued me. So I'm going to go and look at the longer piece on that. But those were the ones that seemed a little different or new from what we've talked about already.
Great. And again, you know, back to this homework piece is consider, Karen, you or others pulling those forward in your list when you submit something. Amanda, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with what Karen's saying. And the one other thing that jumped out at me in this document, which I know we've touched upon, but maybe it's something we should think more about, is the idea of species selection or composition for future conditions. So I think, you know, it's easy for us to be thinking about right now, but we do know that there are projected changes over time that we should factor into what we are prioritizing.
Yeah, good point. All right, well, we have pages 20 through 27. I don't think we should be covering them now because I want to make sure you have time and the public has time to comment and you have time for the other items after that on the agenda. But I would just say that to not forget these pages when you're putting together your short list of ideas that you want to make sure are advanced for further consideration. Jen, thank you so much. I think that was really productive. And why don't I open it up to public comment, and if you're on the line and you've been observing the meeting and you would like to make any comment at all, if you could just press the raise hand function and then I'll recognize you. And is that Doug?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. I really want to promote the emphasis on early pre-commercial thinning. It's extremely important. And also it is one process where the landowner receives no income. There's no commercial value yet. I live in an area where the big trees, crop trees, are oak and pine, which are splendid trees for sequestration. It's reached the point that there is so much sprout growth, particularly of red maple and beech, that it's pretty much reached the point where if you don't work on thinning out, removing them, more likely than not, you're not going to get your pine or oak to grow. And I've done a lot of that personally on my lots. And it's hard work, but it works. There's a lot of acres I have that are in pine and oak growing nicely that wouldn't if this were not done. I just think it's a huge push towards getting a larger, healthier, more diverse forest. And
Awesome.
I'd also would like to second Karen thoughts about coming up with sort of an irreducible list of a few most vital practice steps to take. Early pre-commercial thinning. And then you mentioned you and Mark mentioned a couple others that are vital. You get a small list of them that are indispensable, and then you can go from there to action steps. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Doug. Tim Tier.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to emphasize, I'm calling in from Biodiversity Research Institute, and I just wanted to recommend or reinforce a couple of the issues that came up in the last link to the adaptation strategies and approaches from the NIAX group. And I didn't hear a lot of talk about fire so far in this call, but this is the first call I've attended. So I do think that the way they described strategy 3 here is actually well done. And I would just sort of reinforce that that's a really important part of forest management, and that sometimes gets lost, especially if you are living in areas where fire return intervals are beyond the, beyond the time of, one human generation. So it is still a really important part. And as we've seen in the Western US, these fire return intervals are changing, directly related to climate change. And so this is a very important area for Maine to be trying to get their arms around. And I don't know how much work you guys have already done on this, but I just wanted to put in a recommendation for that. And secondly, I would also like to say that there's a lot more interest in soil carbon as part of the carbon cycling of many systems around the globe. And I realize that it's easy to think that there may not be a whole lot there, but because I heard a comment stated that it was really only in relation to whether forest practices were damaging soils. But I would also suggest that a lot of forest debris that comes from forestry practices obviously plays an important role in recycling carbon back into the soil. So just making sure that that aspect of soil regeneration and carbon cycling doesn't get lost. So that's all I got to add. Thank you.
Thank you. So Bob Seymour first, and then Sally Stockwell.
Hi. This is a very difficult problem you're facing, and I guess I would just urge you to look at these when you're thinking about practices and silviculture and things you can do to individual stands, to view those through the lens of a much larger resource. It's silviculture for board feet, silviculture for plantation studwood, ends at the end of the stand, right? You get your money and you send the wood to the mill. Silviculture for carbon cannot be evaluated at the stand level, even though silviculture is a stand level practice. You have to look at a large landscape because we're talking about the atmosphere over Maine. So the studies that are really valuable are those of Adams that have looked at resource level real world practices where you take the actual resource and you apply practices to the real forest at a large scale. And what he has shown is, I mean, he's reviewed these for you, I think is really revealing that anything that increases the stocking levels over the, increases growth over harvest is going to be the thing that moves the needle. That's why plantation forestry, I've historically not been a huge advocate of short rotation, high yield forestry for carbon. But the reason it works is because you're replacing, just as Alex said, you're replacing low quality, low yielding mixed stands that haven't been managed much of at all with really high yielding spruce plantations, which have 4 or 5 times the stocking, right? So that resource goes from a low stock state to a high stock state. And then in the end has a higher harvest. That's the win here, right? doing pre-commercial thinning, all these things are great, but in the end, you know, if the guy down the road goes and liquidates 100 acres, it's all for naught, right? So little things do matter, but the context is given by a landscape here, not by individual stand level analyses. As much as I love to do those, believe me, I can do them with the best of them. I spent my career doing it, but carbon is much more challenging this way than just simple timber production silviculture. End of statement.
Thank you. Sally, go right ahead.
One word of caution that I put in the chat, but I just wanted to emphasize as well, is that one of the things we're seeing here in southern Maine when we're going into doing some of these pre-commercial thinning projects, especially in older plantations, is that we're seeing rampant expansion of invasive species as a result of opening up that canopy and allowing a lot more sunlight to come in. And once we've got that going on, then you have a whole different challenge. We have a whole different challenge in front of us. So we just have to keep that in mind as we're thinking about these practices and what makes sense, and that it differs in different parts of the state. You know, that risk is different in different parts of the state, and for small landowners versus larger landowners.
Thank you. Any other public comment before we move on? Okay, not seeing any other hands. Very helpful public comment. Thank you for sticking it out and participating. Wanted to just take a quick moment to review the executive order list of requirements, essentially. This is page, if you could turn to page 29 and do a quick look through the action items A through I as we're thinking about the design of the next meeting. Just general reactions to whether you feel like we're on track in terms of the logical sequence of looking at these issues, what you think would be helpful to turn to next. And then just spoiler alert, up to this point, the thought was for the next meeting to move toward hearing some presentations or reading materials about existing programs to understand how some existing programs are already structured that are trying to get at this, and how they incorporate either particular practices or take some other approach. So barring a major concern about that direction, that would be largely where you'd be headed for the next meeting. But it doesn't mean we couldn't take care of some other things at the same time. So any reactions to what you're seeing on this page of things that we should probably be trying to address at the same time? Sorry, Ivan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think these sessions have been fantastic, and I think we're on the right track in general, or we're on the right track, full stop. I think a lot as I listen to the discussion about probably the information that is relevant to B and I, and B is where is the carbon right now? What portion, you know, what components of the 10 to 10,000 acres exist in what condition? In other words, what's the stocking? How's it distributed? And does that inform the targeting of priority practices as we develop a program? And ultimately, in 5 months, we're supposed to have numeric goals and targets for increased sequestration, which is a very quantitative and I think challenging task to do. And so the sooner we start to look at those kinds of numbers, the better. So I think it's all good. And the plan for the next meeting is great. For me, I feel like if in fact there are areas based on the demographics of ownership or the character of them that are clear priorities for programs, I'd like to have that in the back of my head earlier rather than later as we go through that.
Yeah, really good point. Before I jump to you, Mark, I see your hand raised. I'm wondering, Don, if there's anything that you might be able to add in terms of progress in compiling that information on B, and if there's anything at all that you might be able to provide for the next meeting around those questions?
I think I said at the last meeting, we have kind of a cocktail napkin estimate that we might be able to refine and get out to you before the next meeting.
Awesome. Let's plan on that then. Then that's great. You know,
for
with all the
me.
caveats that you need to put in there is fine. Mark, go ahead.
You largely addressed the comment and question I was going to make. But I do think it's important that we have that conversation sooner than later, because if we are going to recommend a goal or targets, it may take a subgroup starting on that, you know, essentially now, to inform a conversation by the full group before we conclude in September.
Mm-hmm. Well, why don't we revisit that as to whether that is sort of a logical approach at the next meeting, once we see what Don has produced. So I'll take Karen and then Barry.
I think it's probably another part of our brain might start to get warmed up on payment funding. If we're doing incentives, what does that look like? Where does that come from? And again, so what you may be hearing, Jody, here are, you know, fine to really be briefed on existing programs next meeting, but be laying the groundwork for these more quantitative requirements that are in the executive order, and then, you know, how to fund them.
Right.
I'm going to be signing off. So thank you. I'm sorry, I have to leave at 5 minutes early today.
Great. Thank you, Karen. And then I'll send a follow-up about the homework. Who is next? Barry.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I
sorry.
just want to echo what Karen said. I'd like to be updated on what the current programs are regarding forest carbon for small landowners. And I know seems like there's a proliferation of them, and they're changing rapidly. And I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel necessarily. So I'd like to just have a, you know, as efficient, as quick as possible, you know, and that might be helped out by having us do the reading material rather than extensive presentations in our short meeting time. But just to have some consolidated background information about that, I think would be really helpful.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Tom Doak.
I don't know if it's for the next meeting, but I would like to have someone from NRCS come in and talk about, you know, I'm not optimistic that the state's going to provide a whole bunch of funding, frankly. I mean, I don't know that how realistic that's going to be, but but there, you know, the programs that NRCS have, and talk about what exists, but also what their flexibility is in adjusting programs in Maine that might fit into some of the things that we develop. I think that's my guess, is that might be the best source of funding, at least, you know, in the short term, for these things. And I think they have flexibility, but I don't understand what that flexibility is. So I think we should have that conversation at some point.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. Barry?
Yeah, I've worked with NRCS programs for over 40 years now, and I guess I will slightly disagree with you, Tom. I don't think that's necessarily the best way to reach a lot of landowners. The process dealing with them they have good money for a lot of programs, but the process is very cumbersome and time consuming, or it takes a long time. I'd rather focus more on things that are more quick and commercially viable, I guess. I guess I wouldn't spend a whole lot of, maybe some background information. We did get some background information in that handout for today, but I think a lot of landowners are leery about dealing with the federal government. I mean, it's hard enough in a certain sense to get them to get cost share through the Maine Forest Service, which is a lot quicker and simpler and closer to home than the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So I'll just put those 2 cents in.
Part of my concern was what flexibility they have to make it more useful to landowners.
Yeah, got it. Okay, thank you. Mark, go ahead.
Just really quickly, that there may be some opportunity for a blending of federal resources and state programming. So we're in an environment where there may be different funding opportunities at the federal level. And I don't think we should rule out that we might be able to attract federal funding to implement a program of our own.
Great. Alec, let me take you as the last comment. Go right ahead.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that while I agree with Barry as regards the difficulties of getting landowners signed up for NRCS programs, and I'm sort of exhibit A, as Barry knows, that I think that we shouldn't not look at the potential for how could you change NRCS programs and how could you deliver them in a way that's much more attractive to landowners.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, you know, when smart minds disagree on something, that's when I pay attention. And I think this is a good point that we need to talk about this one further. So where I think the last thing would be helpful for me to get input from you is there are particular programs that are in existence. We could get a presentation, brief presentation on the American Forest Foundation TNC program, any number of others that I know next to nothing about, but basically finite carbon or Sylvia Terra, or I don't know, LTA, VLT. Any reactions at all about if there were only one presentation, because we don't really want to spend more than 25 to 35 minutes of a 2-hour meeting in presentation, what might be most useful to you all? Alec, is that a new hand for a new thought about this? You're on mute.
No.
Okay,
no.
sorry. And answering this question, then I'll let you go. So you have to give me an answer. So then the meeting will be done.
Ivan will tell you.
Ivan, go ahead, and then Tom.
Well, no, so my question was back to the task force tasks on A. Is there any other state that's gone through this process that we know of?
Not exactly.
Okay.
There are some parallels. Vermont had a forest carbon task force maybe 2 years ago.
Okay. So I mean, I asked that sort of rhetorically in the sense of, is there someone we might want to hear from another state that's already been through this process? It would be different, but that we would learn from.
Yeah, okay, that's helpful. Let me think about that one. Good, Tom.
Well, I think there's a couple things. I think it is useful to hear, and I don't know which one or ones to hear from, but I think there's a difference between some practices or some individual specific programs that the state would do and the carbon market side that the private efforts that are being developed on the carbon market side are probably going to be the future, that the states aren't going to be running individual state programs on carbon. I don't know, maybe it doesn't seem like, because now you have to, landowners are going to go where they get the best deal. So you're going to have to always keep changing it to get the best deal if you're running it as a state program. So I'm thinking I would like to hear from a couple of them about, how they see the future of carbon markets and what they require now and what they see the future likely to be and the opportunities.
All right, well, that's helpful. So Tom and Amanda and Tom Gordon and I will have a debrief call Monday morning. And so it's fresh in our minds. And so this is definitely helpful. I don't know exactly where we'll land, but it's very helpful to inform the conversation. So I think this is a good ending point. I'll follow up with just kind of a recap of what the homework is. And thank you all so much for taking the time. Really good meeting. Amanda, if you had 1 minute to stay on, I don't know if you do.
Yeah, I can stay on.
Okay, perfect. All right, thank you all.